et messieurs. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Je m'appelle Hamid Jorjani et au nom du Conseil international du Canada, le chapitre de la capitale nationale, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette table ronde virtuelle sur la diplomatie de désarmement. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, the traditional territory of the Wendat and Haudenosaunee Confederacy. May we honor the Indigenous stewards of this land and grow in right relationship with all the Indigenous peoples. Today's roundtable is featuring some of Canada's top subject matter experts in disarmament diplomacy. You have already received a detailed biography of our distinguished speakers and the moderator. I will briefly just go through an abbreviated version of the biography. I start with Ambassador Peggy Mason. A lawyer by training, is president of the Rideau Institute and vice president of the Canadian Pugwash Group. Ms. Mason served as Canada's ambassador for disarmament from 1989 to 1995. Ambassador Paul Meyer, a distinguished career diplomat with the Canadian Foreign Service, has served as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations and to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva from 2003 to 2007. And he is the current chair of the Canadian Pugwash Group. He also does some academic work in terms of as an adjunct professor, rather, I should say, at Simon Fraser University. Ambassador Marius Grinius is a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a member of the Senate of the 30th Field Regiment of Royal Regiment of Canadian Artillery. He is a former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations and the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva from 2007 to 2011. This event is moderated by the internationally acclaimed Canadian journalist, Michael Petrou, professor at the University of Ottawa and editor-in-chief of Open Canada, an online magazine published by the Canadian International Council that aims to engage Canadians in a conversation about foreign policy and international affairs. At this time, without further delay, I would like to pass the microphone to Michael.
Thank you, Hamid, and thank you to all our panelists. I'm looking forward to this conversation about a vitally important issue, and I'm especially looking forward to the feedback and engagement from members of our audience. I would like to start off with opening remarks from all three of our panelists, and I will begin with Peggy Mason. Peggy, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be able to participate in this roundtable discussion. My remit is Canada's contributions to nuclear disarmament. In my opening remarks, I will just briefly look at Canada's main initiatives and approaches with a view to identifying what more is urgently needed. I note that this work I'm going to reference by Canada is carried on almost invisibly with the occasional press statement, if that, and dated descriptions on the GAC website. It's almost an elusive thing to find out what we're doing. So I'll start with a comprehensive test ban treaty, banning nuclear testing in all environments for all time. Canada was a lead co-sponsor of the annual General Assembly resolution calling for the negotiation of a comprehensive test ban treaty for years in the face of adamant opposition by the United States. And in the April 27th CIC Arms Control webinar, I described some of the bullying that I and other co-sponsors experienced from the United States to cease and desist with our nuclear deterrence undermining effort. We did not. Finally, in 1994, a consensus resolution led to negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament and the CTBT's, that is the treaty's adoption by the UN General Assembly in September 1996. Canada ratified it in 1998 and created the CTBT National Authority to implement it. The treaty has been signed by 185 nations and ratified by 170, but it cannot enter into force without ratification by China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, Iran, Egypt, and the United States. The latter, United States, has signed but not ratified. And Canada contributes to the verification regime for the CTBT through 16 international monitoring stations and laboratories located throughout Canada. Our main ongoing effort is Friends of the CTBT. Along with Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, we have co-hosted a ministerial level Friends of the CTBT every 2 years since 2002 to encourage countries to ratify and bring the treaty into force. The last one was held in September 2018 on the margins of the General Assembly in New York, so one assumes the pandemic interfered with the 2020 meeting. Our other long-standing, ongoing, and at one time very important initiative is the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. This is not a treaty yet. We've long been engaged in trying to launch the negotiation. This is a treaty to ban the production of the nuclear material necessary for their explosive power, a very important Canadian initiative by Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. And this was also the subject of a Canadian-led resolution in the General Assembly for years during the Cold War until it finally achieved consensus in 1992 and was sent off to the CD for negotiations, where, alas, it is stuck, despite at times very determined efforts under Canadian chairmanship and a lot of good, solid preparatory work for the negotiation were it ever to begin. But unlike the resolution that sent this issue off to the CD, which dealt with both production and stockpiles, the current, once the CD got a hold of it, the mandate was focused on production only, which means it privileges nuclear weapon states that have enough stockpiles. And this discriminatory approach has certainly been one, but not the main factor for why progress has not been made to get to an actual negotiating stage. So all of which to say, it's not like we're doing nothing, but as noted, key long-standing initiatives like the CTBT and the FMCT are stalled, and they're stalled because the 5 nuclear weapon states party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the other 4 nuclear armed states who are not, are engaged, the so-called declared and non-declared nuclear weapon states are engaged in nuclear weapons modernization and other activities that are increasing, not decreasing, their reliance on nuclear weapons. Although with the election of Democratic President Joe Biden, he has said he wants to end this trend and decrease the role of nuclear weapons in American defense strategy. And in the face of these very negative trends, Canada has not been exhibiting anything like creative leadership or even innovative thinking for which we used to be known, and what these 2 initiatives that I've just opened with stood for. But we are now standing in the way. As a NATO nuclear umbrella state, instead of being a NATO nuclear nag, as we once were known, we are now an apologist for the nuclear weapons states in direct contravention of our legal obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the treaty Canada describes on the GAC website as the cornerstone of global efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and to promote nuclear disarmament. Note the dual role of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, horizontal, preventing the spread, and vertical, the Article 6 obligation on all NPT states parties, nuclear and non-nuclear alike, to pursue good faith negotiations for nuclear disarmament. That brings me to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This entered into force on 22nd January 2021. It's the first legally binding international agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons with the ultimate goal of their total elimination. Adopted in New York in July 2017 with 122 states in favor, it now has 86 signatories and 54 states parties, none of whom are nuclear weapon states or nuclear allied states. Canada did not participate in the negotiations. Let me quote from former Ambassador Doug Roach, who in a briefing with Paul Meyer and myself on the treaty to the Canadian Senate stated that through this treaty, the majority of countries have shown that they want to build a global security architecture without nuclear weapons. The NPT nuclear weapon states, notwithstanding their Article 6 legal obligations, have been hostile to the new treaty from the outset, and so has NATO, with the North Atlantic Council's foreign ministers, including Canada, missing no opportunity to attack the treaty in communique after communique. And the latest one was the summit level meeting in Brussels on 14th June, where they stated in the communique, we reiterate our opposition to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is inconsistent with the Alliance's nuclear deterrence policy, is at odds with existing non-proliferation and disarmament architecture, risks undermining the NPT, and does not take into account the current security environment. Quite to the contrary, of course, this treaty is entirely complementary to and seeks in particular to advance the NPT Article 6 obligation on all member states, as I said, nuclear and non-nuclear alike, to engage in good faith negotiations for nuclear disarmament. Note that consensus is required for this communique, so Canada went along with it. So I guess that means if we take this statement about the inconsistency of this treaty with NATO's deterrent policy, you know, what about NATO's own stated goal of nuclear disarmament? What about its Article 6 obligation? So now I want to turn briefly to a May webinar hosted by UNIDIR, a UN disarmament research body, on another initiative with which Canada is associated, the Stockholm Initiative on Nuclear Disarmament, because the discussion in the UNIDIR webinar has direct relevance to this latest NATO communique and to what Canada should be doing instead of what it is doing. Launched by Sweden's foreign minister in 2019 and now coordinated by both Germany and Sweden, the Stockholm Initiative on Nuclear Disarmament's aim is to advance concrete and realistic steps for nuclear disarmament through 22 stepping stones, which have been agreed by 16 participating countries, including Canada. The aim is to engage the NPT nuclear weapon states in an effort to stave off another failed NPT review conference, which is bearing down on us. It should have been in May 2020, is delayed to August 2021 because of the pandemic, and it's likely to be delayed again. Canada has been associated with this initiative from the outset, but has never actually participated at the ministerial level, generally sending a parliamentary secretary. We learned from an interview, this is what I mean about having to ferret out, it's like a detective work as to what Canada's doing. We learned from an interview given to the Arms Control Association, the American prestigious Arms Control Association, recently, that the Stockholm Initiative had tabled a working paper as part of the NPT preparatory process, co-sponsored by 16 members, including Canada. We also learned that a letter had been sent to US Secretary of State Blinken, signed by Sweden, Canada, and Germany, seeking to engage him in dialogue on the 22 stepping stones. Speaking at the UNIDIR seminar was Tom Countryman, chairman of the board of the Arms Control Association. His remarks were made before the May summit, and he expressed the hope that the summit communique language about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons would be tempered. It was not. He talked about the importance of the affirmation in the stepping stones that did come at the Biden-Putin summit just held, that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. But he then went on to underscore the absolute importance of additional steps to devalue the role of nuclear weapons in US defense and deterrence policy, reducing their salience, in the words of the stepping stones. And he went on to say that this is what stepping stones members should be advocating for over the next few months as the nuclear posture review in the US continues and policy is developed. And that the members should be doing this with the US leadership at every level, with the North Atlantic Council, and within the UN. And that brings us back to the NATO communique and what an opportunity that was for Canada, and instead, what a retrograde step it was. Now, I've lost track of my time here. I can say more now, or I can just stop there and we can go to questions. So I need some sort of indication, I guess, from Michael.
Well, what I'd like to do, Peggy, if it's okay with you, I'd like to hear remarks from Paul and Marius first, and then we'll circle back and we'll take questions that can be directed to any of the panelists after opening remarks. So if that's okay with you, I would like to pass the digital mic on to Paul Meyer, please.
Okay, thanks, Michael. In looking at the track record of Canada in the disarmament field, I would like to focus on what has happened with respect to the so-called emerging technologies. Now, technical developments and their weaponization have long been drivers of arms control and disarmament diplomacy. States are frequently challenged to catch up to these developments and devise agreements to eliminate or at least mitigate the risks they can pose for international peace and security. Outer space has been at times a real focus of Canadian diplomacy. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty established important limits to state action in this environment, prohibiting the placement of weapons of mass destruction in orbit and the militarization of the moon and other celestial bodies. This, however, was an insufficient barrier to the development of so-called counter-space capabilities, notably the testing of kinetic anti-satellite weapons, or ASATs, that produce debris. For some time, Canada championed the goal of the non-weaponization of outer space and invested in the development of technical capabilities that could verify any eventual ban. In the mid-1980s, the Verification Research Unit at the then Department of Foreign Affairs developed plans for a PACSAT, peace satellite, that would be used as a means of employing both space and eventually aerial imagery for the purposes of verification. Verification of an outer space accord, but also eventually verification of a conventional forces agreement. Regrettably, the Verification Research Unit was eliminated in the late 1990s, and Canada lost a competitive advantage in this crucial support for disarmament. The Bush administration's abrogation of the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, in 2001, and with it, the sole legal ban for the deployment of space-based interceptors, initiated a new era of concern over a space arms race. In 2004, the then Prime Minister Paul Martin called for an extension of the Outer Space Treaty's prohibition on WMD to cover all forms of weaponry. This political direction led to some innovative proposals by Canada for confidence-building measures to preclude space weapons and attacks on space objects. Canada circulated 2 working papers in 2007 and 2009, respectively, at the UN and the Conference on Disarmament, expounding on these ideas. The election of the Harper government seems to have taken the wind out of these initiatives, and Canada basically went silent on the space security file after having been viewed as a leader in this field. This stance has been carried over under the government of Justin Trudeau, which has largely been a passive witness to the current heating up of the space arms race. Recently, Canada has expressed support for a test ban on kinetic anti-satellite weapons, although there's no evidence to date whether Ottawa will translate this support in principle to putting forward a specific proposal to accomplish this goal in practice. Canada was a bit slow in recognizing the importance of the international dimension of cybersecurity. The Global Affairs Canada still has not produced a cyber foreign policy document, although one was promised back in 2010. The potent universal technology represented by the internet, like all new technology, can be employed for good or bad ends. The absence of common regulation to govern the use by states of this technology beyond their own borders has facilitated the growth of offensive cyber operations for purposes of espionage and/or disruption or damage. In the face of this militarization of cyberspace, the UN since 2003 has been trying to have its member states agree on a set of norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And it succeeded in 2015 in having states endorse 11 voluntary norms. These include the non-targeting of critical infrastructure and the prohibition on states employing proxies to carry out malicious cyber activity. Unfortunately, as seen in recent years, these norms of restraint seem to have been honored more in the breach than the observance. Canada has generally been active in the UN work on a normative framework, but has not been prepared to criticize the militarization of cyberspace, presumably because its own 2017 defense policy review signaled that Canada was going to develop its own capabilities for offensive cyber operations. The government has not been fully transparent with its actions in this regard, employing a euphemism, quote, active cyber operations, to describe these capabilities. There was never an open political and public debate as to the wisdom of Canada joining the small circle of states which have opted for offensive cyber capabilities. One might have explored the option of energizing diplomacy to restrict the expansion of offensive cyber capabilities rather than quietly aligning with the cyber warriors. These two examples of how Canada's disarmament diplomacy has engaged new technology and associated security threats could be extended to other technological developments, notably the military applications of artificial intelligence, for instance. The potential for lethal weapon systems to operate in an autonomous mode with no meaningful human control is not a theoretical threat, as many deployed systems currently possess this capability. In the context of diplomatic discussions to prevent such potential misuse, there was an indication of possible leadership on the part of Canada. In the Prime Minister's mandate letter of December 2019 to his then Foreign Minister Champagne, but was also inherited by the current Foreign Minister Marc Garneau, it was stipulated that he should, and I quote, advance international efforts to ban the development and use of fully autonomous weapons systems. End of citation. Notwithstanding this specific direction, the Minister and Global Affairs appear to have done nothing whatsoever to progress this file. In order to play an active diplomatic role on any of these challenges requires, in addition to the basic political will to act, a well-staffed and well-resourced capacity within Global Affairs Canada that is lacking. Filling this capability gap is necessary if Canada is going to be able to take up a leadership role in encouraging diplomatic responses to these new security challenges and curb the escalating arms race we are currently witnessing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Marius, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think Peggy and Paul have kind of gone through the entire spectrum of current challenges that we have, especially in the nuclear world, and also the future challenges, security challenges as described by Paul. So I wanted to take a little bit of a different tack on this. I've got 3 comments to make. First, a little bit about what I consider is the changed geopolitical context. And there is, I believe, a new great game that is being played out between an ascendant China with global ambitions, certainly aided and abetted by its junior partner, Russia, And a United States that is still, I believe, in a strategic retreat, thanks in part or mainly perhaps to the chaos that had been created by Trump. And certainly there has already been reference to the G7 and NATO summit statements. One thing that they have shown is how much the United States is actually preoccupied with China, calling it a strategic competitor, and probably more. Even now a reluctant India is coming on board in the context of the Indo-Pacific region and the rejuvenation perhaps of the Quad. What is, I think, pretty important and a point of optimism is, of course, the US-Russia joint statement, and especially the repetition of what President Reagan and Gorbachev said in Reykjavik. Second, given this kind of geopolitical context, I would say that there is an urgent need for Canada to have a full-blown foreign policy review. Back in 2005, Paul Martin, Prime Minister Martin, issued, quote, Canada's international policy statement. And it listed 23 priorities and 81 key initiatives, somewhat over the top, I would think. The Harper government, its foreign policy, I think, has been guided more by ideology than anything else and has not been particularly helpful. And the Trudeau government eventually did publish a defense policy paper that to me seems more like a wish list for new military hardware than anything else, and it certainly was lacking an important foreign policy context. And so I do believe that it's a serious, urgent need for a Canadian foreign policy review. And we really have to see where Canada can once again be a contributor to international stability writ large. And I note that the CIC is just putting out a statement on foreign policy, and maybe it already will have all the answers. Third and last point, again, in this broader foreign policy context, I think there is a need to reestablish Canada's commitment to arms control based on smart cooperation. Again, as Peggy has described, there is considerable stress on the current arms control and disarmament architecture. And as Paul has described, it is non-existent. The new, potentially what ought to be a new architecture does not exist. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done. Global Affairs Canada was mentioned in its low silhouette these days, very quiet. But Global Affairs Canada really has to be the prime mover with support of a wide range of security stakeholders, including the NGO disarmament community, but also those groups who focus on military security and intelligence matters. One of the issues for Canada for a long time, and it's still an issue, is that there are too many silos out there and nobody's talking to each other very often. One quick fix, I think, for Canada to show commitment, I believe, is to reestablish the Ottawa-based position of Canada's ambassador for disarmament, roles that Doug Roach and Peggy Mason have had in the past. And that role would mean representing Canada abroad in that wide spectrum of arms control and disarmament issues out there. And equally important, I think, is for them to explain back to the Canadian public what is actually happening and what needs to happen. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marius. I should say to all our audience members that we are looking forward to your questions, and you can submit these by writing. If you go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, simply write your question there, and then I'll be able to read them and pass them on to our panelists. I'd like to start things off myself, if I might, though. This is a question to everyone, although it's triggered in part by Marius's comments about reinstating the ambassador for disarmament, and but I think this might apply to, or I think all of you might have something to say about it. I'm just wondering, when it comes to disarmament efforts that Canada perhaps should undertake, and perhaps does in a more limited fashion than you would like, what tools of influence, what levers does Canada have to actually force or cajole consequential change? I mean, I can imagine, and I'm being speculative here, and please stop me if I'm wrong, that some of the pushback might be, well, look, you Canadians, you're being hypocritical. You're across the Atlantic, you're sheltered by the United States. Easy for you to say, but we live in a different reality, those of us in Central Eastern Europe, for example. How does Canada respond? How do you convince? How do you cajole? How do you influence this debate when you're dealing with your allies and perhaps some of Canada's adversaries as well? Is there any insight you can shed on that? Peggy, I know you've been in the trenches, so maybe I'll go to you first. What are the tools you have that you had and that Canada has today?
I don't think there's one broad brush answer. I think you have to look at each individual situation, who we're talking to, who we're trying to convince. And I spend a lot of time with respect to the NATO communique, and that's because it's a consensus document. So the bottom line power that Canada has there is to refuse consensus, or if we want to be slightly less confrontational, we can footnote. We can indicate, we can allow the statement to be made, but we can footnote saying that we have concerns. We could do that about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, when NATO, if a majority of NATO member states are determined to continue with the critique. I suspect if Canada started that dialogue in NATO and suggested that we felt strongly enough about not continuing this gratuitous and entirely counterproductive criticism of the treaty, that we were prepared to enter a footnote indicating our disagreement. You see, the benefit of a footnote is that it opens it up. Publics can see that this is not a solid wall, that there are in fact countries in the alliance that have a concern about why the alliance would be gratuitously attacking this treaty. Why are they so afraid of this treaty? And so that's a very good example. The reason why I keep coming back to the NATO dialogue is because Canada can, we have some leverage. We have some actual leverage. I mean, there are also all the other diplomatic tools, starting with good ideas, well thought out. And that's the starting point for, any negotiating, any dialogue that you have. So it's not, and of course, the other bottom line with respect to nuclear weapons, with all due respect to folks saying we're sheltering under the umbrella. I mean, a nuclear war, the Europeans are not going to be able to confine a nuclear war to themselves and its consequences. So we all have a stake in this. We all have a stake in we're all, or most countries are states parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we have obligations under that treaty. But the starting point of all of this is the dialogue, is entering the dialogue. And we have a lot of common ground, and we have a lot of differences but we have a lot of common ground, huge common ground with other NATO members. So there's a place where Canada can start to have this dialogue. And of course, it can be behind closed doors at first. But the communique was a wonderful opportunity to make a small step forward that really would have had a big impact with all of those countries who signed on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. You know, it really was a tragic missed opportunity for Canadian diplomacy. I'll stop. Others, I'm sure, will have comments.
Marius, Paul, either one of you would like to weigh in on this?
Let me just say a few things. First of all, Canada traditionally has brought good ideas and a lot of common sense. And I've seen Canada continue to have such a low profile. What we brought to the table once upon a time was world-class capacity in verification. And that disappeared. That was a presumably political decision back in the late 90s, which unfortunately really hit hard Canada's capacity to stand up and say, here's what goes on. There is an important, both Paul and I served at NATO 4 years each, I think, during the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Empire. And so we perhaps have seen, and Paul can talk to it, different aspects in terms of security. And it has to be an ongoing dialogue. What I have been watching from afar is NATO doctrinal extension. I mean, they talked a lot about China. Why is NATO going there? Geographically, it used to be something about the North Atlantic that we were worried about, but suddenly NATO aspects are in Afghanistan, retreating out of Afghanistan. And think about what happened in Libya and the former Yugoslavia. So I think a Canadian contribution would be common sense to talk about what these particular important issues are in the context of what I consider a new world out there. Thank you.
If I might pick up on Marius's point about, the power of good ideas, and I think a French intellectual once said, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. But it needs also to be marketed and supported by good, solid research and homework. And I'm struck by the contrast. I mean, the Canadian Department of National Defense operates a couple of programs to fund research relevant to defense subject matter. The MINDS program comes to mind in that regard. Where is the equivalent in global affairs, funding to support arms control and disarmament research, to do that critical, detailed homework that then provides a basis for taking a leadership role on the international arena. We've shown that it could be done in the past, and it could be done again, but it does take a certain willingness to invest in these areas. And I think that is one of the realms which we could improve greatly with not an incredible amount of investment.
Thank you. Yeah, Peggy, go ahead, please.
Yes, I thought I just might jump back in because it ties back with a point that Marius also made about reinstating this particular Ambassador for Disarmament role that only Doug Roach and myself held. And just because it provides an opportunity for a focal point within global affairs to re-energize the work that we're talking about. And because that particular, of course, we had several. We've always had a number of ambassadors for disarmament. One time we had them in several places involved in negotiations. And the main one, the ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, who also had other roles. But those ambassadors, were not accessible to the public. Marius talked about that. In the terms of reference that I had and Doug had, it was threefold, and it came out of a promise that Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. made at the first UN Special Session on Disarmament in 1978, where civil society had made it known that they wanted to have access to a Canadian disarmament ambassador so they could express their concerns on this issue. And that promise took a long time to be fulfilled. And in fact, it was first actioned under the Mulroney Progressive Conservative government. But the key point was that it was a threefold mandate. First of all, based in Ottawa for part of this, so based in Ottawa and was a roving ambassador essentially. Then you would go out, particularly to New York for the arms control sessions in New York, and then also to Geneva for the treaty, for the NPT treaty reviews, but based in Ottawa for two reasons. One, so that consultations could be held with the Canadian public, but two, so that, and this is where this focal point comes in, so that the ambassador could directly input into the development of arms control and disarmament policy, including an ability to report directly to the minister if required. So it was quite a powerful position from that point of view. And so I think I mean, one of the things that I've long had concerned about is the atrophying of capacity, particularly in the Harper years, and the necessity to rebuild, the really urgent necessity to rebuild capacity in global affairs, but that'll take time. This establishment of this focal point could be done quite quickly. Some money would have to be put behind it too. No use coming up with good ideas if there's absolutely no funding to support it. But that could be an interim step while capacity is really being rebuilt, because you're not going to raise issues of concern within NATO unless you're very confident, that you've got a good solid idea. So all of these things tie in together.
Thank you, Peggy. I'd like to go to a question from one of our audience members. Dennis Kovton says, and I'm going to read this in its entirety. At the moment, the incentives for nuclear states to disarm are weak. North Korea views nuclear weapons as its primary security guarantor. For Israel, they are weapons of last resort, particularly as Iran is pursuing its own program. For India, China, and Pakistan, nuclear weapons are important in regional power calculus, and Russia is pursuing modernization and expansion of its nuclear arsenal. Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in the mid-1990s in exchange for territorial sovereignty guarantees, which were ignored by Russia when it annexed Crimea and began waging complex warfare in the Ukrainian east. Influential Ukrainian politicians said that giving up nuclear weapons was an historic mistake, and this view is shared by a significant proportion of the Ukrainian electorate. Is it realistic or indeed wise, from the security perspective, to pursue disarmament if nukes are once again seen as a guarantor of territorial sovereignty and national security? How do we respond to that? How do we respond to the Ukrainians? That's a good question. I mean, they gave this up, their guarantees were ignored, and now they're occupied. What do we say? Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's a little more complicated than that. I mean, would Ukraine really want to have retained nuclear weapons against Russia? Have a Chernobyl many times over on their territory as a result? Let's get a little more, I think, realistic. It was a failure, and there was a rude violation of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which I should point out, it wasn't just Russia that expressed, that it would not violate Ukraine's independence or territorial integrity. It was also the UK and the USA. Neither of those other powers have been particularly effective in response. Maybe the answer would have been a more rapid intervention against the little green men that were showing up in Crimea prior to the overall takeover. And there are ways in which, and they are currently being pursued, in which the Russian Federation is being penalized for that rupture in respect for international law. So I wouldn't rally around that that cause of bringing back nuclear weapons into Ukraine. I think there are much more practical ways to advance Ukraine's sovereignty going forward.
Hey, go ahead.
Yes, I really want to jump in here because I was one of the UN ambassadors that was dispatched to Ukraine to advise them publicly. We did this publicly, not just privately, the consequences of them attempting to keep Soviet nuclear weapons, because let's be very clear about this. They weren't Ukrainian nuclear weapons. They were Soviet nuclear weapons stationed on the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. In fact, technically, it's probably very clear that Ukraine had absolutely no capacity to take them over, to operate them, and were missing significant elements of them. So it's a delusion for Ukraine, for this idea to keep being peddled that, oh, they could have had nuclear weapons and they were taken away. But the point I want to make is that, you know, the international community at that time was at a high point of engagement in reducing the number of nuclear weapons. And we did, of course, have a lot of success between the Soviet Union, then Russia, and the United States in reducing those weapons. And in 1992, the UN Security Council meeting for the first time ever at summit level declared that the further spread, so they were trying to lock in place the numbers that we had, the further spread of nuclear weapons to new states was a threat to international peace and security. So anybody who transgressed that would be a pariah. And of course, that's how North Korea has been treated, as a pariah, with unbelievably strong sanctions against them. They're the only one party that's left the NPT to become a nuclear weapons state. And so that was the message we were delivering to Ukraine. We used the example of North Korea and said, do you want to become a pariah like North Korea? We think not. And they thought better of this illusory option of nuclear weapons. And also, I'd like to challenge, I'll just stop with challenging the statement that the incentives for nuclear weapon states to disarm, to completely disarm, yes, but United States and Russia are very concerned about getting nuclear risks under control. And that is one of the bright spots we've got now, is that out of that summit, there's a real engagement, not to risk reduction, but also to further nuclear reductions. And of course, they are continuing to reduce their stockpiles. It's just that there are a lot of other dangerous trends that we've got to get under control as well. Okay. So I'm making such a point of this because it is a dangerous argument that really has to be put to rest.
Okay, maybe given the dangerous nature of the argument, I probably shouldn't play the devil's advocate role that I'm going to, and I don't want to speak for Dennis, so Dennis, forgive me for doing so. But I mean, one can make the argument that nuclear deterrence works. I mean, North Korea is not going to be invaded because it has nuclear weapons. I mean, if I'm another pariah state and I'm looking at North Korea, I'm thinking, not such a bad option. I mean, is that? I mean, if it was delusional, why are so many? Not so many, but why do we have states that pursue this as a means of guaranteeing national sovereignty?
Well, you know, you can argue that but I think you have to look, as Peggy's noted, at the risks of this. What happens when deterrence fails? What are the consequences of this? There's a whole now legacy of very close calls, i.e. where there's been very close to the detonation of nuclear weapons through accidents, very close cases of possible launch of retaliatory missiles because early warning systems were bringing up false indications of an impending or ongoing attack. Some have declared it's only sheer damn luck that we haven't had a nuclear weapon detonation. And it's also, I think you have to pry a little more closely into, you know, the nuclear deterrence, you know, works, our argument. You know, was Argentina deterred against attacking the UK's territory? Was Vietnam deterred North Vietnam against war against the US ally? Vietnam again was prepared to attack China, even though China possessed nuclear weapons. Or in an earlier stage, you know, North Korea and China were prepared to launch attacks against South Korea, a U.S. ally, when the U.S. had the nuclear monopoly nuclear weapons. And, you know, similarly, you know, Iraq was prepared to attack Israel, even though Israel is known to have nuclear forces. So it's the history, actually, when you delve into it, it doesn't support that nuclear deterrence has always been effective in preventing the onset of war. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
Fair. Okay, thank you. I want to bring in some other voices here. Marcel Timmermans says, considering this is another good question. We got a couple of them coming up. Considering the asymmetrical nature of cyber warfare, and particularly the challenge that tracing a cyber attack poses, might Trudeau's government be right in developing its cyber offensive capabilities? In cyberspace, are there feasible alternatives to the old axiom that a strong offense is the best defense? Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think maybe you could pose that question to, the 17 million Canadians who had their data breached by the Life Labs cyber attack, and not to mention the critical infrastructure and the ransomware that we're beginning to experience in this country and elsewhere. I would also contest, actually, attribution is getting a lot easier rather than harder regarding those launching offensive cyber operations. And then the question, as soon as you engage in the offensive game, of course, you become fair game for retaliation and for those who go against you. I would have liked to have seen at least a greater effort to see if we could, through diplomatic action, have precluded some of these, some of what we're seeing now. I mean, the reality is, in the past, yes, you had potent weapons, chemical weapons. Why don't we all have chemical weapons? It's because there were some more sober thinking individuals who led the leadership, so we could have a comprehensive prohibition in the Chemical Weapons Convention. And now it's only a small handful of outlier states that aren't party to that. So I do think there are alternatives, and we should have pursued them with more vigor.
Okay, thank you. A question from Terry Wood. Sorry, yes, Peggy, go quickly.
This one will be very quick.
Go ahead,
this one will be very quick. Just to say that the other problem with offensive, so for a narrow military objective, an offensive cyber attack lets loose cyber technology because it's common ground that once it's used, it's out there and it will be retrofitted and used against. So for a narrow military objective, the risk is run of extraordinary damage to the civilian infrastructure on which we all depend. So in this case, it is the antithesis of a strong offense is the best defense. In fact, what we need is a huge effort, collaborative effort at the best possible defense and protection against these kinds of attacks. And we saw the start of that in the discussion between Putin and Biden on this list of critical infrastructure and agreement not to attack it, which of course goes back to Paul's point about the norms of restraint, because that was one of the agreed norms of restraint, not attacking critical infrastructure. So let's get those lists exchanged of critical infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much, Peggy. I have a question from Terry Wood. To what extent do you believe that arms control and disarmament is a front burner issue for most Canadians? I ask because it appears that our foreign policy is now mainly driven by narrow and more immediate domestic political concerns. Marius, do you want to take a go at that?
I think Paul and Peggy monitor that very, very closely within, particularly within the Canadian Pugwash group and some of the sister organizations. What I have been seeing, though, is less interest in the world of especially nuclear arms control, and much more interest by youth into climate change, into humanitarian assistance, into human rights, and disaster relief. A lot of things that are happening right now. The United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights or for Refugees just recently said that this has been a banner year for the number of displaced people, both internally and externally, as refugees. And yes, you could talk about, it's almost a theological debate on nuclear deterrence. Does it work? Doesn't it work? Is there heaven? Is there hell? and all the possibilities. But then you have the real world disasters that are out there. And I think a lot of young people are much more engaged in that than the theological debate on nuclear weapons.
If I might, though, obviously nuclear weapon use would be a disaster of great proportions, including for the climate. And recent research shows that even a very limited exchange, let's say between India and Pakistan, would lead to a massive transformation of the climate, and anything like a reduction of 20% of crop yields in the northern hemisphere because of the sediment and particulates that will be thrown up in the stratosphere. So I think we have to do a better job of making the connection that actually, nuclear weapons are an existing threat, an existential threat. They can really ruin your day if they ever get used, and that consequently everyone, because there's no discrimination in the impact of a nuclear weapon explosion, should be concerned with it.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Alex Leger here. Following up on the comments regarding rebuilding Canada's capacity for arms control and disarmament, should the priority be more or more formalized engagement with academia within Canada, or primarily focus on building expertise at GAC and other federal agencies? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, if I might, because during my time as Director General for International Security Bureau back in 1999, 2001, we actually had a very rigorous program, research outreach program, which engaged interested academics around the country, and it had the very purpose of developing made in Canada expertise to help support governmental action. And in my mind, it was a wonderful program, that linked policy interests of the department, but also with the interests of individual academics, and we received, I think, great benefit from that. Alas, like so many of these supporting capacity programs, this too was starved of funds over the years, and is now just a pale shadow of its former self. And is also noted, this more secretive, less transparent posture has also, I think, inhibited that kind of exchange. I hope we can revive it.
Okay, thank you. Marius, I see your hand. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add what Paul has said, these are not mutually exclusive. These outreach to academia has to be part of the strategy, if you like, including the conversations that Global Affairs Canada should have with civil society writ large, and that means academia on no matter what the spectrum of opinion is. But it also requires another player, and that is the security establishment writ large, including national defense, who tended to sit in the background and not say very much, but should also express their concerns and have a real conversation. And that is very, very rare. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marius. I have one, I think, final, if that's okay, although this is your last chance, those of you in the audience that want to add one. But I have a question from Robin Collins. How likely are we to see alternatives to nuclear deterrence, in brackets, other forms of deterrence, for security in the next Canadian foreign policy process? How best to stimulate this side of the conversation? Who would like to answer that? It's a nice broad question to bring in some good ideas, I think. Was that a hand? Peggy, go ahead, please.
Yes, okay, I'll dive in first. I mean, Robin Collins and I, of course, have worked very hard on trying to stimulate in various organizations, including at the Rideau Institute and also in the Group of 78, to try and stimulate discussion on alternative approaches, of what we call a shift to sustainable peace and common security. And we've looked at UN work on this and have developed our own document on this. I would say the starting point, and I keep hearkening back, but the starting point really has to be this deeper dialogue within NATO. I mean, the United States is now under Biden at least starting to look at what's the minimum needed for credible nuclear deterrence. And that's a starting of a discussion, which I think can then lead to, okay, what are the next steps? If we're all committed to nuclear disarmament, as all NATO members are, then how are we finally going to get out from under this? But there has to be a much more meaningful dialogue with the nuclear umbrella states. And right now, the nuclear umbrella states are an impediment, can be an impediment. I mean, when Biden wanted to move to no first use, it was Japan and some of the Europeans that said, oh, no, that's going to undermine the American commitment to our defense. So there are a lot of things that have to be unpacked here. And that means dialogue. And I guess I have a concern. Marius, I've been thinking about, and we've made calls for a foreign policy, Canadian foreign policy review ourselves, but I'm worried about doing that when global affairs doesn't have the capacity that it needs. Because in any kind of discussion on nuclear deterrence and alternatives there too, right now, national defense is going to win that argument hands down. So yes, I come back to the point about rebuilding the kind of capacity within global affairs and through this dialogue with the academic community and building their expertise, so we can really get some solid thinking behind, what's next? How do we actually move towards the NATO avowed goal of nuclear disarmament? And that means moving away ultimately from nuclear deterrence. How do we get from here to there?
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Peggy. Thank you all to all the panelists. What I'd like to do now is conclude the Q&A session, but I'd like to ask all the panelists to maybe offer us some brief concluding remarks before I hand things back over to Hamid. I'd like to do this in the reverse order, if I might. So, Marius, could you start us off, please?
Yeah, just one comment. We talk nuclear deterrence, we talk nuclear disarmament, all that sort of stuff. I think that there's a more fundamental issue there, and that is we have to look at military doctrine. Anything to do with nuclear weapons, I believe, is 20th century, maybe even 19th century in terms of thinking. And it's outer space, it's cyberspace that are the future battlegrounds that we have to look at very, very carefully. Yes, continue to talk about nukes, but they are so old-fashioned and old thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paul, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll say endorse Mary's thought. I mean, we shouldn't always be playing catch up. The whole idea is trying to get out in front of the puck, as it were. Similarly, we need to have a department, again, that's prepared to enter into dialogue with Canadians. Its websites, as Peggy already noted, often are embarrassment because they're so outdated. They lack actually Canadian content, and they don't really provide even thin ground for citizens that might be interested in knowing what the government is doing in their name. We used to have an annual consultation, very structured consultation with civil society representatives and academic experts each year to sit down with officials of the foreign ministry to go over the whole spectrum of non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament issues. I think that was very healthy, and I would hope that the department could see itself to convening and supporting such a dialogue going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Peggy, please.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we all strongly agree on the dialogues. And coming way back to this Stockholm nuclear initiative for nuclear disarmament, of course, engagement on military doctrines is one of the stepping stones. And of course, nuclear weapons are one component of that, but we've got this additional problem of this very dangerous trend of the entanglement. I mean, that's the term that's used in the stepping stones, the entanglement of nuclear and conventional systems and opaqueness with regard to that. And that is something that President Biden has said he's very concerned about. So, yes, engagement on the doctrine, and Canada can play, as I've said, can play a direct role. We have a direct role. I mean, the NATO strategic concept is being revised again. Where is Canada? Thank you very much to everyone. And I must say, even though, I really, I always come on strong and when I feel strongly about something, but I really do thank Dennis Coveton for his question, because it's precisely by asking these questions that we get the dialogue and we get to think further. And of course, I want to make the point that we have done a lot at the Rideau Institute focusing on how to get Ukraine out of this terrible situation it's in, and focusing on the Minsk II process and trying to get Canada to do much more in that regard. So, Ukraine is a pressing issue for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Peggy Mason, Paul Meyer, Marius Grinius, for all your contributions. I learned a lot, and I'm confident that members of our audience did as well. Thank you to them. And I'd like to just pass the mic back to Hamid Jorjani to wrap things up. Thank you all.
Thank you, Michael. What a presentation, what a debate. First, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers and the moderator for a very informative discussion. You eloquently described the issues and provided very intriguing ideas to enhance Canada's capacity to contribute to this important international endeavor to rid the planet of this wasteful and destructive enterprise. I also would like to thank the participants, as Peggy mentioned, that it is the active participation of our audience that we are able to enhance our debates about the topics that are of interest to the public. And this event would have not been possible without the generous support of the CIC members and our volunteers who provide technical support, namely Mr. Samuel Amua, Ms. Carolina Shimada, and I also would like to thank Ms. Elizabeth Kingston, President of CIC, Canada National Capital Branch, and Ms. Christina Warren, Manager of our virtual office, as well as members of our program committee, Ms. Lillian Thompson, Mr. Greg Goldhawk, and Mr. Viken Gondarian. If you're not a member of CIC, please do consider becoming a member and help us to bring these events to you on a regular basis. Once again, thanks to this powerful team on this roundtable, and I'm much honored to be on this panel, not as a speaker, but just someone who is from the CIC National Capital Branch. What a group. Thank you so much. Have a nice summer, and we'll see you again in the new season. Thank you.